Yesterday was focused primarily on the role of funders. Today, on the real business of scaling, what really happens on the ground in terms of taking successful interventions to scale, not just for a transaction, but for a permanent change in outcomes for large numbers of people. Large numbers of people, in this case, meaning people approximating the size of the problem or the size of the need. Couldn't have a better panel for doing this. If this were sports, we'd be watching the World Cup finals today, in the sense that we've got people. I can't imagine a better team to talk about this issue. We're going to talk about, for example, the difference between transactional and transformational scale. We're going to talk about what it really takes to create sustainable outcomes at scale. We're going to talk about the respective roles of government, the private sector, social enterprise, and funders. We're going to talk about what localization really means and looks like when you see it in practice. In other words, we're really into it today. And I'm going to begin by giving you just a little bit of background for those of you who don't already have it on the community of practice, and I'm going to use that as a launching pad for a conversation about today. My name's Larry Cooley. I'm one of the founders, along with Johannes Lind, of this community of practice. I can't think of anything I've ever done in my career that I've enjoyed more. So here's the story about the community of practice. Johannes and I, some years ago, 20 plus, were working on the issue of scaling, and it was a kind of a lonely enterprise at the time. And so we called together people who we thought might be interested. And that was a group of 30 or 40. That group of 30 or 40 is now upwards of 4,000. Whether you know it or not, you are now all members of that community of practice. And what it means is those of us who care enough to want to learn from each other and to try to advance the state of the practice, meet and exchange with each other with no other agenda other than to try to do development better. That kind of work has led us into a variety of different things. In trying to look for how to support each other, we originally focused on trying to exchange experience, and that's still the centerpiece of the community of practice. But more and more, we've branched beyond simply trying to help one another to trying to move the needle on the way this work is done. And so you heard yesterday, and you'll hear more in the future about our work to try to affect the way both donors and implementers really approach the business of scaling. The work that we're going to be talking about throughout this process is focused on a concept we call sustainable outcomes at scale. And both the sustainable and the scale are important in that conversation, in that we're deliberately trying to move away from the notion that it's simply a series of projects and focus instead on what it really takes to make permanent change on the ground at the size of the problem and in a way that stands the test of time. And to do that, we're trying to use this community of practice and everything else we can get our hands on to try to move the case forward. Community of practice has done 28, soon to be 29 newsletters, several hundred webinars. We've done annual events like this. This will be the 8th of those events. This particular one has 12 sessions, 90 minutes each day, pretty much with one exception in this time slot, on a variety of topics. Yesterday was a plenary, today is a plenary, and the final one on the 26th will be a plenary trying to look to the future. In between are 9 sessions organized by 9 of the community's 10 working groups. So each one organized on a different subject or theme of interest to that particular working group. You are all invited to all of those. There's, of course, no cost for any of this. Just go onto the website and sign up, www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com. Again, to go back to the idea of a community, we mean that quite literally. And that means those of you who wander into our midst, as some of you may be doing for the first time today, will be encouraged not just to listen, but to participate. And that starts today. We're going to have a chat room that's open. And if today is anything like yesterday, it will be very active. Please feel free to put in comments as well as questions. We'll do our best to respond to a few during the event, and we'll try to pick up on as many as we can after the event in subsequent exchanges and publications. A word more about the logistics of today. For those of you that don't have English as a first language or who just would like to multitask as we go, there's a translation option if you go up to the ellipse at the top or to the drop-down menu, you can choose your language of choice for interpretation. And there's also the possibility of having closed captions in English, although we'll be speaking in English. If it helps to have a written text on the bottom, you can do that for yourselves as well. Let me now come to the session itself. For those of you who have not yet had the chance to read Isabel's wonderful, wonderful book about scaling, I would commend it to your attention, not only as a reading on scaling, but if you're going to read one book, pick this one. Pick this one. It's going to give you as good an overview of scaling and what it really means on the ground as I've seen, and I've read quite a lot on this topic. Isabel's been a member of this community of practice from the beginning, and so it's hard not to feel kind of a family relationship to this book. But this, I think even if I didn't feel that, I'd have the same admiration for it. In addition to laying out very clearly a whole range of concepts that are often used loosely, the book does something that I think is very important, which is that it delves deeply into some cases that you might call the superstar success cases of development. It doesn't stop with the superstars. It looks at the challenges also, but it shows us that this is possible. And so I think there's not only information, but inspiration in looking at this. And I'm happy to say that the panelists we have today embody exactly that. They come from these organizations with these kinds of successes. And so I'm hoping, in fact, I'm confident that we will get from them a little bit of a look under the hood in terms of what this really looks like in practice, in terms of trying to make sustainable scale happen. Let me just say a word about Isabel. So Isabel is, in addition to being a dear friend of mine, is somebody who comes to this through a very, very interesting road. I don't know anyone else who's trained both as an economist and as a psychotherapist, but this is one. In addition to that, besides perspectives from government, she spent a long career at the World Bank before founding Imago Grassroots, which is trying to work the problem from exactly the opposite end. And simultaneously, for now 10 years, has been teaching this at the Harvard Kennedy School. So what you see in the book is a culmination and a combination of some rather unique perspectives that I think give her a very particular insight into what it really takes to achieve scaling in a sustainable and a meaningful way. I'm going to introduce the three panelists after Isabel speaks. She'll speak for a few minutes. Then she and I will have a very brief exchange. Then we'll go one by one through the three panelists and then convene the panel as a whole. Throughout all of this, please do use the chat box actively. We will try to get to some of those questions, and I promise you we will make good use afterwards of anything we don't get to during the session. So without further ado, let me turn to Isabel with our grateful thanks.
Thank you, Larry. And I have to say it's a very important moment for me. It's coming full circle because when I left the World Bank, first of all, I left thinking there are a lot of problems that are being solved by grassroots organizations who know the answers, but they cannot scale. I knew how to work at scale. I manage a portfolio of $36 billion, but I didn't know how to scale. So when I looked around and read a lot and decided to teach a course at Harvard on scaling up so that I would learn a lot. And during that research, there were two books that inspired me, and they were the best around. And that were the reference books for my course for the last 10 years. And one was Larry's book, the MSI Guide to Scaling Up, to many of you have seen, and the other one was Johannes, the other co-founder of the Community of Practice, who edited this beautiful Brookings Institution book on scaling up. So now being able to present this and having had Larry as a partner in many ways, and Johannes, who also wrote the foreword, it's a really important moment for me personally. So with that, I want to start, and Gabby, if you can share the slides, they're going to take a few seconds. As Larry said, this is the result of many years of teaching the course, but also applying these frameworks to these organizations. So the first important thing I wanted to share, we can go to the next slide, is that this book is dedicated to Ilabat. This is where the journey started. When I was the country director for the World Bank in India, I met Ila, and that was in 2006. And I saw the amazing work that she and others are doing in Sewa, who now are 2 million women. I thought this has to scale, and it has scaled, but the women wanted to go much further, and her capacity to change the world with the women was what inspired me in this journey of founding Imago, of focusing on scaling. And so that's why the book is dedicated to her. The next one. So as I said, I was working with the World Bank. So if you look at this pyramid, I was working in donors with donors. Our loans were 100 million, 500 million, a billion. We even had loans of 1.5 billion in South Asia, and working with donors. And I could see that a lot of the tough development problems could not be solved from the top down. And yet also when I was living in Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, India, I saw grassroots social entrepreneurs that were innovating and finding the solution to these tough development problems, but they could not scale. So there was a missing middle between the top-down solutions that needed needed innovations in order to get the development outcomes, and the bottom-up solutions that could not scale. So that's what has defined the journey, and this is what you will also see in the book, how to bridge, how to connect that missing middle. Next one. So this is why I founded Imago Global Grassroots 10 years ago. The vision is a world in which the innovations and solutions developed at the grassroots can reach global scale. And our mission is really to change the way people think about development, where the poor are not recipients of aid, but actually are agents of change. And you see that a lot throughout the book, examples of how by doing that, you can really unlock very tough development issues by involving them. The next one. So the book was developed after 10 years of teaching at the Kennedy School and 10 years of working in Imago with some of the most iconic grassroots around the world. And today, two of our panelists, one from SEWA, one from BRAC, are actually from those iconic organizations around the world. So this is the framework of scaling up that we have in the book. It's adapted from Cooley, Cole, and Vet from MSI. I started with their framework, and little by little, as we started to implement, we found out that we needed to complement the framework with some of these things that I'm going to go into. So the vision was already there. What's the gap? What's the intended scale of the program? And then we found that it was important to add an additional step, which is the system. Who are the stakeholders? Why is the system failing to deliver? Why is the market not delivering? Why is the government not delivering? And other organizations. Understanding the system is a big contribution of the way that we think about scaling through the book, understanding whether one is scaling within a system and one has to change the system. And then step 3, which is also in MSI, is the model. And we increase the model, we increase, and we sort of included more details on what this model needed to be unpacked. Yes, what's the intervention, but then what's the theory of change about the social outcome? The theory of change is just a hypothesis, and it needs to be tested, and it will change many times until you really get to see the social outcome that you want as an organization. Then what's the essence or the minimum viable intervention? We borrow a lot from the lean startup literature in terms of finding that minimum viable intervention that will do the work and will be easier to scale rather than having a lot of bells and whistles and expensive and complicated interventions. So some of the organizations in the book, like Pratham, found that minimum viable intervention, translated a very complex problem into a complicated one that could be tackled by a simple intervention, which is the teaching at the right level. Then what is the business model? Whether you are a nonprofit or not, you need to know what's your business model. It will determine how you will be able to scale, how you will generate the revenues, but also it will determine whether you want to scale through the government or through the market. So we go a lot with the organizations into the business model and learning from the private sector about the crucial importance of that, and not depending on donors, but actually trying to get as much as possible from in terms of revenues generated in the organization. And then the question whether you're scaling within the system or changing the system. And then we go to the foundation, which is also adapted from MSI, the MSI framework, which is the financing needs, the human resource needs, the leadership challenges. Larry always told me that the leadership part is one part that he hoped we looked at in this book. It's all throughout the importance of how leadership changes when you scale. And then what are the missing parts of the value chain when we scale, especially at the base of the pyramid? There are many missing parts of that value chain that need to be addressed in order to scale. And then what are the policies that need to change? And last but not least is building the evidence, how we use evidence from the beginning, from the moment that we're testing the theory of change. We use this evidence in order to understand whether we are in the right direction. But at the end, also, we need to know how do we use this evidence to maintain stakeholder support, and what data do we need to generate. So that is the framework for scaling up, which is part 1 of the book. And also it looks at why is it so difficult to scale, and do we need to change the system. Next. So part 2 of the book looks at the pathways to scale, and we go into for-profit enterprises, governments, and funders. For-profit enterprises are the best at scaling, and we have seen since 2008 with the birth of all these unicorns that they have really redefined scale, not only in terms of the speed at which they scale through technology, but also with the tools that they use. Design thinking, scrums, agile methods are all methods that actually we have used with grassroots enterprises, and Mirai is here with us. We have used it with the social enterprises of SEWA, which really help at the grassroots, which really can help governments. There's a lot to learn from the private sector for both grassroots, governments, and funders. The second chapter is on governments, 2 ways to innovate within the government to scale. It's very difficult to innovate in such a large organization where the risk of failure is very large and unwelcome by the taxpayers. And so we talk about both having innovations outside, like the self-help groups that were there for 30 years and then scaled through the National Rural Livelihood Mission, or innovations inside, and we use oportunidades as something that was incubated within the government, and how important the political part of it was in terms of its viabilities. And then we also talk about funders. Johannes and a team in the community of practice is working much more on that, but this continuum of funders, from how the philanthropy has really exploded and is doing a lot of de-risking and taking chances, but there's no coordination between the philanthropists, mid-sized donors, and then the large multilaterals. And so scaling from a small innovation to, for example, through the World Bank, it doesn't happen. And this is why it doesn't happen, because it requires to think about this continuum for scaling. Part 3 talks about taking social enterprises to scale. We have a whole chapter on BRAC, and Greg is today from BRAC is today with us. BRAC is the example, the inspiration, the artful way of scaling up. Is the only organization who has been able to really get into that missing middle. Part of their secret are the social enterprises and the way they have used them to finance social sectors, so they have a very low dependency on donors. And then we have a chapter on the promise of social enterprises as a new development tool. Just like PPPs were the thing 20 years ago, we think that social enterprises are a new development tool. And there's a chapter for policymakers on what does it take to have an environment that will promote them. Then part 4 is how do you use evidence to scale? RCTs were a huge revolution in economics and really helped a lot of change in the economic thinking, and economics is very resilient to change. But RCTs were really welcome. But RCTs are useful just for a few important moments and points. But evidence, as we learned from Pratham, needs to be used throughout, from the beginning when you're experimenting, when you're trying to find your intervention that works, in rapid iterations, and so we talk about a whole set of tools that you can use to accompany this journey of sense making through the scaling process. The next. So we have 3 lessons, and with that I'm going to close. The first lesson is that scaling up is a process of transformation. It really involves navigating complexity and complex systems, and transformation takes time. We work with our clients sometimes 3 to 5 years, and it really has a lot of letting go involved in it. And so that's the first point. The second point is that the scaling up involves having the people closest to the problem at the center of co-creating the solution. In Imago, we made a point of not showing up as experts. In the World Bank, we showed up as experts, and I learned how many mistakes we made from that. And so we show up with questions, these questions that I just presented to you in part 1. And the experts are actually the people who are closest to the problem, and we work with those questions, helping create a sort of safe space where we can honestly talk about them, answering them, knowing which ones don't have an answer, and helping iterating to find those answers. And the third lesson, and the final, is that scaling up involves adaptation and frequent iterative experimentation at every stage of the process. And so that's why it is so difficult to scale. That's why it's so difficult for large organizations to scale, because this adaptation, experimentation, failure is something that few organizations really have an appetite to do. And some of the most amazing organizations like Pratham actually have made an art of understanding that experimentation, making mistakes, learning from that, and having a learning organization is at the center of scaling. So with that, Larry, I'm going to turn over to you. We can stop screen sharing. Yeah.
Well, you're going to turn over to me to talk to you. But I'd like to, if we could, Isabel, start with what struck you most in moving from the perspective of the World Bank to the perspective of Imago on this, and working with organizations of the sort you're describing from a very different point of view and with a very different entry position on this thing. If you could instruct your World Bank self, your former World Bank self, with the knowledge you now have, having done it the other way, what do you think is most striking about the contrast?
So for me, the most striking question was, I was very frustrated. We had something called the development marketplace, where we invited innovations and we gave grants, $250,000, and you would think that was enough for them to mainstream it in the bank, and we never did. And I always had that question, why? And so for me, I think what was striking was the distance between the World Bank, the business model of the World Bank, and what the grassroots needed. I understood why this was not happening. I understood that showing up as experts was really closing a lot of possibilities and understanding. And what was most striking for me the first years working with SEWA was how welcoming the women of SEWA from the grassroots, who sometimes didn't know how to read or write, how welcoming they were to this exploration and to being invited to this co-creation. I also was surprised of how extractive we were perceived. We came, not just the World Bank, also researchers came in, asked questions, left. The group never knew. So when we had sessions on strategic tensions and clickers with SEWA, they were like, we're so happy that we're hearing what the group is thinking, because we can take it back to our sisters. That extractive nature of what we were doing in the World Bank and what we do as researcher was, I think, the biggest surprise for me.
Yeah. Do you think it's a I'm from Mars, you're from Venus kind of a problem, or do you think that gap is potentially closable?
I think it's very closable, and it comes from lack of understanding of the potential that people at the grassroots have. Goes back to this idea of changing development thinking. I still remember what we heard from the Voices of the Poor, where the poor say, poor is not just not having income, is not being able to change the world around me. And so that agency, also another understanding was, we talked about empowerment, and I realized how arrogant that was, how it had the idea of bringing power to the people when people really have the power, and it was all about activating that agency, that sense of agency. So it's very closable, this gap. It just requires for that human being to be at the center of the problem solving, of understanding what the system around is perpetuating, and how do you need to go through alternative pathways to do it.
Let me ask you another question. I think it's a related question. You've clearly now worked with some of the real superstars in scaling from the bottom up. If you look at organizations like SEWA and Pratham and BRAC, or Oportunidades, which is kind of a different model, but again, important lessons. Why are they so few? I mean, these are in effect the unicorns of our world.
Yes.
But why aren't there more?
Because it's very difficult to scale. To scale, as you well say, Larry, and you taught me, the organization that starts and the organization that scales is a different organization. And so you need to let go of a lot of things. You need to go, for example, on your minimum viable intervention, let go of things that are not essential. And with Greg, we worked a lot on that. And that is not easy because people are invested in many things. Different people are invested. So letting go, and also have an intermediation function. Have some help from outside to do this transition, this transformation from A to B, where B might look very different to what A looked. And so I don't think there's a lot of leaders that are willing to do this humble letting go and letting come that involves scaling up.
Such an interesting answer. I think that draws a little bit on your psychological training as well as your economics training.
Yes.
Let me ask you just one more question. In terms of your aspirations for the book, specifically for the book, I know you wrote it in part as an outgrowth of your work with students at Harvard, and it's really clear how it's useful to them and also to people like those of us on the call right now. If you had a bigger vision for how it would be used, what would you hope it would either set in motion or provoke in people?
So for me, the best comment I got was from Rukmini Banerjee, the CEO of Pratham. She said, this book is written for people like us, which means she's running an organization and she can really understand what it says. But what has happened so far, and I really hope, is that this book helps as a background for a conversation, like the conversation we hope we're going to have today. It's really about thinking, not about just scaling, but how do we have better development impact? And if this book can help in that conversation, I would be very happy. I think Sid and Josie, the co-authors, would very much share with me. We're trying to change the development narrative, change the development conversation.
Well, congratulations to all three of you on genuinely a terrific book. I'm going to ask you to pause and stand by, and I'm going to talk to some people about your book, and then we're going to come back and talk about it together. I'm going to introduce now Mirai Chatterjee, who some of you may know, but some of you may not. Mirai has spent an entire career, 40 years, working with SEWA, which arguably is one of the most remarkable organizations I've ever taken a look at. It now numbers, I think, almost 3 million women, initially poor, in many cases no longer poor, as a result of their association. And if you think about what this looks like when it really works, I don't think you could find a better example than SEWA is. SEWA stands for Self-Employed Women's Association. You could think of it as a kind of a union. I'm sure Mariah will tell us more about that. But it does things that I think most of the rest of us only dream about in terms of actually getting people engaged in turning around their own circumstance in a constructive way and fulfilling a lot of the things that Isabel was just talking about. So I'm going to ask Mariah to now answer a couple of questions that I thought of when I was thinking about you, Marai, and the particular road that Sewa has traveled on this. And one of them is that Isabel in her book talks quite a lot about the role of the private sector. Actually, let me start a different place. I want to start by asking you, how did Sewa do this? It's the same question I was asking Isabel, which is there are relatively few organizations that have managed to pull off what you've done these many years. And looking back on that, do you think there's anything the rest of us could learn from that would be instructive?
Thanks very much, Larry, and heartiest congratulations to our sister Isabel, who's very much part of the Seva movement. I think, first of all, our founder, Ila Bhatt, focused in on a need, the problem, identifying the problem and the gap, which was the invisibility, lack of voice, lack of organization, lack of organizing of informal women workers. The second, I think, which is very important in our scaling up is value-based, that this is not just an organization, but it's a movement. It's a movement with very clear values. And as Isabel was explaining, same for us, women, informal women workers are central. We have faith in them, in their potential, in their ability to lead, to scale up, and to lead social change, not just for themselves, for their communities, and indeed for their nation. I think it is them which guided all action and gave us direction for scaling up. And of course, these values, as many of you know, are Gandhian values, inclusive, democratic, all faith. And I think that alignment was very important for scaling up. Another really bedrock of our scaling up, if I may put it that way, is what we call the Agevan approach, which is grassroots women leaders powering the scaling up, powering the movement. These are local women, and they are from different trades and occupations and geographies, but again, aligned in the movement and building their own decentralized democratic membership-based organizations where ownership and their leadership has been key. And I think both of those, ownership and leadership, have been key to scaling up. And ours is a horizontal solidarity approach. So sort of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, if you will, and federating and building a movement rather than just building vertically. I think the other way that we've been able to scale is paying attention to local context and local leadership, not a cookie cutter approach, encouraging women in different geographies, not just in India, but in all continents, to, build their own organizations and movement. I think the integrated approach of Seva has been critical for scaling up. For example, setting up Seva Bank, and providing financial services, healthcare, insurance, childcare, and so on. It brought more and more women into the movement, into the family of Seva, if you will. And then I think what Isabel mentioned, I'd like to also underscore that, which is the leadership of the founder, who was a visionary. It wasn't just about a handful of women, but it was about a movement way beyond the borders of India. And she was a unique leader who exhorted us to think big while staying small in terms of humble and modest and being adapting and so on. I think also the role of campaigns has been very important in scaling up. For example, the campaign for home-based workers' rights, which went right up to the ILO, and also partnerships. We owe a debt to, I don't even know how many people who have been our co-creators and who've been with us on this journey. And finally, I think we're a lean organization. We're not top heavy and cost heavy. So we're able to adapt. And as Isabel said, there've been also plenty of failures, let me tell you, but experiment and evolve and be agile. So it's not about scaling up an organization, Larry. It's about scaling up a movement, a whole host of organizations. Some remain small, but altogether they're a force.
I have a million questions I want to ask, but I'm going to hold myself to just one, which is that in talking about Sewa, Isabel used you as an example of drawing from some private sector approaches on this. Can you just talk a little bit about what you drew on and what you needed to do to adapt those sorts of tools and approaches to the circumstance you were in.
Absolutely, Larry. So, most of our sisters who built membership based organizations and collective businesses or social enterprises, most of us came through organizing, through the movement, if you will. So, I think there was a real need to build systems and processes, including especially on financial management. It's poor women's money, every rupee counts. So, we're, financial probity and systems. But here, as Isabel, and we learned the word from her, co-creating. We didn't know that word, but we were doing it. What's different is that the co-creation, participation in decision making at all levels, especially at the grassroots. So consulting with them so that all are on board and there's buy-in. Then I think learning to take calculated risks using data. We have lots of data, but we are yet to use it, in a proper way, so that it's not just shots in the dark. But I must say, sometimes shots in the dark also work. Like Seva Bank, Women's Cooperative Bank was a shot in the dark. It worked. But anyway, using data and data-driven, evidence-based decision making. Having dashboards so it's more systematic. Then I think focusing on business outcomes, on profit, because many of us, as I said, came from the social movement, if you will. So focusing on profit. Profit is not a bad word. It needs to be there. Otherwise, the entire enterprise will collapse. And here, though, both the business mindset and the social impact. It's not enough just to make profit. You must reach out to more and more women and also enable their journey to economic empowerment. The agile sprints we learned from Imago and Isabel has already mentioned, what a huge difference it made for the Ayurvedic business of our health cooperative, Lok Swasthya Seva. And I think finally, flexibility, the ability to adapt to new markets, new opportunities. I know that, not all private sector are flexible and adapt, but there are many examples and we learn from those. So I think just to conclude, what we learned is we lots of things to learn from the private sector, but we can't just standardize and scale. The importance of local context, then scaling in different ways, as Isabel has already mentioned, so I don't want to repeat. But one way perhaps I'd like to emphasize, apart from government, is the federating of many small enterprises. And because we take this integrated, holistic approach, we're slow. And many people have said to us, why after 52 years, only 3 million women members? I mean, you're 1.4 billion. Well, we want to carry everybody along with us. And I think what Isabel also said, it takes time, it takes patience, perseverance, and persistence. But it pays off in the end.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely perfect. I'm going to now, if I could, call on Ndidi, if you could come on screen, Ndidi. There you are. Ndidi Nwuneli is yet another friend. This is a little bit of a reunion for me. So thank you again for making time. And we're going to ask you today to wear two hats, the one you've been wearing, although you've been wearing several, and the new one you're about to put on as we talk about this book. And I'll just say a couple of words by way of introducing you. I still think of you as a youth leader, although I saw in your bio 25 years of experience. It's hard for me to think of you that way, but for me, I guess if you start from my perspective, you still count as you. So in a sense, we're looking at what the next generation takes as scaling, both aspirationally and in terms of procedurally. How do you go about doing this? And not surprisingly, you see a lot of entrepreneurialism in that, and that certainly characterizes your own background in this. Ndidi set up businesses, set up organizations to help businesses, wrote books about what entrepreneurship means in Africa, how to keep a social edge, and all this while still being commercially minded. She's a co-founder and continues to lead the Sahel Consulting Agriculture Group, and is on the boards of countless organizations, Rockefeller Foundation, Agra, GAIN, the list goes on. And I would say equally importantly, maybe in some ways even more importantly, is about to put on the hat of the executive director of the One campaign, which is needed more now than ever, and it's got a distinguished history of trying to shape the behavior of funders toward trying to support these activities. So I'm going to ask you, Ndidi, if you would, to wear both of those hats. I'll go to one first and the other second. So thinking back in your past and current role as somebody who's both been and encouraged other people to be active entrepreneurs and sometimes social entrepreneurs, what do you take away from this whole conversation about scaling, and Isabel's book in particular, that has pertinence for how we actually bring these things to fruition and take something that might once upon a time seem like a little cottage enterprise and really look upon it in terms of the scale of the problem?
Thank you so much, Larry. And listening to Isabel, I kept on smiling because, as you know, my first book on social innovation is on scaling. And then my second book on food entrepreneurs is also on scaling. And I reflected on the fact that how she mentioned a business model and the challenges around scaling in many contexts and the missing middle. And I said, this is all my language. So Isabel, we should have met in our previous lives. And obviously, I share a lot of your convictions. And I'll just underscore the whole concept of a business model, because between my first and second book, attempting to scale organizations, social enterprises in both the for-profit and non-profit sectors, I came up with 6 components in the African context, but I think they're universal, that are critical for scaling. The first one is that the business model has to be demand-driven with measurable value addition. And I think the biggest challenge we face is around that, what is value and how do you measure value? And because many of our transformations and our interventions are short-term, but the time frame for our transformations are longer term, we often are under pressure to show results. And oftentimes we assume that it's a positive result, and then we start scaling and find out that we might have missed a few things. So that first key component is critical. The second is low cost, because a lot of interventions in our context can't reach millions because they are quite expensive in terms of how they're designed from the pilot scale. And leveraging innovation and technology allows us to reduce the cost. And I've seen that in agriculture in particular and food systems. The third is the issue she raised about systems change and coming in with the context that if you're going to work in emerging economies, you have to change the ecosystem. You have to change the policy environment, and it has to be supportive for your work to scale. And I've seen that with my work with LEAP and African food change makers and Sahel and even ACE Foods. If we don't shape policy, we wake up and find out that some of our interventions are going to be frustrated because the policy has been changed in the favor of those who benefit the most. The fourth is that you have to build resilience into the DNA of anything you want to scale. COVID-19 showed us how disruptive shocks can be. The Ukraine-Russian war, again, in the food ecosystem showed us about disruptions. And again, we continue to see shipping challenges, etc. So how do you build resilience? Climate change is another huge shock we continue to face in many ecosystems. So how do you build resilience into your DNA? And then the final one is the importance of storytelling and branding, because storytelling attracts the mission-driven high achievers, attracts the funders, but then you need to show clear results, especially when you partner with the public sector, the private sector, and civil society. So that is what resonated with me. And I saw that as I attempted to scale, and I have to say, Larry, many of the ventures we have started have scaled, but some have struggled to scale because scaling is difficult, like Isabel mentioned. And the key for me has been partnerships, because if you don't have the right public, private, and nonprofit partners, in African food change makers, I started with a tech-enabled platform saying I want to be the Facebook, DevX, and LinkedIn for ag and food entrepreneurs, and we want 1 million entrepreneurs across Africa. And now we don't have 1 million. We have close to 4,000 members after 4 years, but we're working in 40 African countries. So we've been able to scale geographically, but not with the membership of quality members. And so it just shows you it is difficult, but it is possible through partnerships.
Somebody yesterday, indeed, had a nice analogy. They said sometimes we create these interventions as if we were breeding in a greenhouse, but they're going to have to grow in a desert. And so trying to figure out what it would really take to do something which is both adapted to and in turn adapts the context that they're in is the challenge we're facing along the way. I want to ask you a very different question wearing the hat you're about to put on. So in the course of the things that you've been doing, you've had occasion, I know, to interact with funders in a variety of different capacities, sometimes on the board, sometimes having an organization that's recipient on this. What do you think you've learned about the role of funders as it relates to scaling that might influence the way you approach the Job at the One campaign?
So I would say that the funding community is quite interesting. And actually, I've been partnering with a few people, Skoll, Echoing, Green, Ashoka, and a few other umbrella groups to talk about what needs to change in funding to kind of match what is changing in the scaling community. So Larry, I think we have to involve you guys in those conversations. And one of the things we've understood is that on the funders, unfortunately or fortunately, have not fully embraced the magnitude of financing required for scaling to happen. And their perspectives are still very much risk averse to taking big bets in the social innovation landscape. While investors in the private sector take those big bets, we see that funders are not willing to be as catalytic and go along with them. So that's why you see a lot of challenges with scaling still, right? Their theory of change is developed from their context, and we still need them to co-develop it with us. And somebody made a comment at that session we had during Unger. He said, are we scaling our work or are we scaling what works? Are we scaling our work or are we scaling what works? And for me, that was a key question. And many times, funders want to scale their work, not what works. And this concept of failure, which I know, Larry, you've discussed, and being honest as an organization is not working. Stop throwing more money at it. Let's really partner with each other and find what works and scale it. And I think that requirement for funders to work more closely together in countries and across countries is critical.
Someone again yesterday had a really nice way of putting that. They said funders need to learn how to decenter themselves. Because as long as it's all about scaling our program, it's impossible to do the things that you and Isabel and Mirai have been talking about. It's just impossible. You've got to find a way to get behind energy that exists and that can be supported in trying to move forward, whether it's commercial or social. I'm going to use that indeed to bridge to Greg here, but I know you're going to have to run, but if you can stay with us as long as you can, please do. We wish you everything good in your new venture. Greg, if you could come on camera for a second.
Yeah, I think I'm here, Larry. Thanks for having me.
There you are. There you are. Thank you for being here. For those of you who don't yet know Greg, he's associated with another one of these superstars, in his case, BRAC, and he's the managing director of the Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative, having done through his career a whole series of things related to poverty and poverty alleviation. And I think for our purposes, most importantly, things that had the concept of both scale and sustainability built in from the beginning. That saw beyond the idea of donor projects, even when they were using donor resources to try and accomplish what they did. And Greg, I want to see if we can pick up on some of those themes. And maybe I could begin by asking you the question I asked Mirai, which is that you are also associated with one of the unicorns in this industry. And as you look back over time on this, if you're trying to unpack a little bit about what made it possible for BRAC to do what it's done, and specifically if you want to focus on the Ultra Poor program to do what it's done, where so many others have not managed to do that, are there a couple of things that stand out for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as Mirai was going, and I was just thinking through all, the first is that our founders, Abed and Ila Ben, were close friends and inspired by each other, challenged each other. That's the first. They were both started in 1972, and interestingly, and obviously in quite different environments. BRAC was in a newly independent Bangladesh. But I listened to Mirai and I was just struck by the similarities. I mean, I think the first would be the patience and the vision to get it right and not rush to rapid solutions, right? There is the emphasis on the single bottom line. And again, just to remind everybody, BRAC's major scaling efforts were its own, not through government. And I'll come to the through government piece, which is a relatively newer initiative for BRAC. But going back to some of the similarities with SEWA, start with people and their problems. Don't come with a solution. Start with people. Learn as you go, figure it out, start things, adapt. The second, it doesn't come up maybe enough, and I don't know if it's in the book, I've not been able to read all of the book yet, but is unit costs. BRAC was focused on unit costs from very early on. Mariah alluded to that in terms of the overhead and other things. If you don't get the unit costs right from the beginning, you just, financially, you won't make it. I was struck, and I'm happy to hear this as somebody who's been in the microfinance business for a long time. The financial services has been a big part of the SEWA and the BRAC story. I mean, in BRAC, we run globally microfinance, but in Bangladesh, we have 4 or 5 major financial services ventures, many of which actually serve millions of poor people in Bangladesh on a sustainable basis. That provides us a real foundation to have an ongoing relationship with people at the bottom of the pyramid. So those struck me as some of the real similarities. I mean, there are some minor differences between SEWA and BRAC, and I think those are also fun to go at, but I think the commonalities are very strong and profound between the two institutions.
Could you pick up on something you alluded to just a moment ago in terms of the more recent focus on relations with government? And I think you may be almost uniquely qualified to talk about that in terms of if we're thinking about scaling initiated by or driven by an organization that's outside government, but where the success depends on government action, sometimes even government implementation on things. Tell us a little bit the story about BRAC and the Ultra Poor program and government.
Yeah, so, and actually just to say, we're still relatively new in figuring out how to work with government. And in fact, we've relied on Isabel for some advice. And so her concept of the minimum viable intervention is something we've used since I started in this role 2 years ago. But Larry, it goes back to something else that's in the book. We at BRAC fundamentally look globally, and we realize there are about 100 million households that live in extreme poverty. Now, that number might have gone up, it goes down a bit, but that's the scale of the problem. And so that we had to ask ourselves, we run a very large program in Bangladesh, and in 20 years, we've put more than 2 million households through that program. But if we were going to have a meaningful dent at the global level, we just felt we had to try and figure out if we could take this graduation style program into government. And that's really something we've only been at for a few years. I've got some early insights and far from any answers. We do have some early experiences, and I'm happy to share more about what those have been. But I would go back to fundamentally one important piece, and it's something that Isabel referred to a bit, which is that BRAC, it's hard, but we've got to take ourselves out of being the main protagonist in the story and make government the central figure in that story. And we therefore need to sort of step back and figure out how to make it work for government. And that's something that's hard for an organization that has been so self-driven for a long time. And I think we're getting there. But that's maybe one of the fundamental shifts that has to happen as you start to think about working with government. You've got to do it their way, not your way. And that's a real adjustment. I'm not sure we're done with that adjustment in BRAC yet, but we're getting there.
Well, I can tell you as someone who's both worked on this and misfired a number of times on that precise issue, I don't think there's a more fundamental issue facing us than that, because when we take on these interventions, we love them. And trying to see it as someone else's that we're supporting, or even more narrowly, trying to crosswalk it in some cases to a different delivery platform, it's hugely difficult. And we put it forward like it's just one more step in the equation, but it's a hugely challenging part of the process. I can tell you, we in the community of practice are focused like a laser on exactly this question now. If I were going to say, what's our question for the next 2, 3, 4 years, that would be absolutely center. And our conversation about donors and funders, which is where I want to turn in just a moment, is subordinate to that. It's basically how can they become part of the solution to that, not substitute their judgment for what needs to happen for that to truly take place.
Yeah.
Greg, let me just ask you one other question, if I could, which is that in terms of the use of the book, this is a much narrower question, but have you had a chance to think a little bit about how to use this sort of messaging around what it takes to scale things in a way that actually advances the state of the practice on scaling?
Yeah, I mean, I would say just given sort of our interaction with Isabel earlier, we've been able to use some of the core elements that are in the book, and going to the specific chapter on scaling through governments, she and the authors define two models, which is bringing in innovation from outside to inside government, and then figuring out how to make government operate. Then there's, maybe the oportunidades sort of example, which is the innovation beginning within government, but thinking about it from very early on. A couple early observations is those frameworks work for us, although I would say at this point, those two are starting to blend together. And the reason is that there already are a lot of livelihood programs in government. And part of our role is to figure out how to make those much more impactful and actually meaningful for people who are in the extreme, in sort of at the most marginalized in society. And so it's actually taking an existing large-scale government program and making it better and more focused on the people who will benefit from it the most. And so I'd almost see in Isabel's 5th chapter that we're probably drifting into a combination of both the models and pathways to scale that she articulates there.
Great. Stay on, and Ndidi, if you're still here, come back, and Mariah and Isabel also, please. There's Isabel. There's Mariah. I have a feeling we might have. Ndidi, you still here? No, I think not. Okay, so let's see if we can pick up where Greg and I just left off and explore. Oh, there you are. Lovely. And go just a little bit farther in terms of what we collectively, and in this case, I'm including all of you, but I'm broadening it out to this community of practice and this whole field of trying to advance a sensitive and thoughtful approach to scaling, what we can do. How do we build off of the kind of lessons in the book and try to bring them into more frequent practice, both on the funding side and on the implementing side? And it has to do with kind of how this kind of knowledge gets transferred. Isabel, maybe I could start with you on that and see what you think. Or what does it take to move a field forward on this?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to build on your conversation with Greg right now, which is that one of the things that we actually took from the Kennedy School, the public policy masters, they use this strategic triangle, which is, I think, very important for when you adapt to government, which is for a government to actually take an innovation and be able to scale it. It needs 3 things. One is that it's technically right, and it can be adapted to each environment, but it needs to be technically right. The second, it needs to be administratively doable. And sometimes that's much easier said than done. How do you have a local government implement something that has been done in a more sort of boutique organization that has a lot more resources or leverage many other resources? And the third, which is the most important one, is that it's politically supportable. I remember when I took Santiago Levy, the founder of Oportunidades, to meet at that time. It was the head of the planning commission, Monte Galualia. They spent the whole day talking about the political engineering of Oportunidades. For a government, that is essential, and for us, we hardly think about it. And so I think thinking about those 3 dimensions is what is going to help this shift into scaling innovations through the government.
Thanks. Keep going. Don't give up the microphone yet. I want to go back to the question that I started to frame before that, which is more on the tactical side, which is as our own knowledge enhances on this, what can we do to try to advance the state of the practice? Is it you're doing it. I'll just put words in your mouth for a little bit. I know you're doing part of it by teaching the next generation of people at the Kennedy School. To the extent we're trying to go from simply being a self-help group to being more, you might say, advocacy on behalf of thoughtful approaches to scaling, what do the next steps look like? I'd like to ask each of you that question, but Isabel, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think we have to show successes. Nothing speaks better than a success. And thinking of successes where you have a framework, where you have the transformation, documenting it, would be, for me, the first step. Yeah.
Ndidi?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the successes, but also the failures. I think one of the things we need to do is have some very bold post-mortem analysis, because we don't do enough of that. And you know, you mentioned unicorns, Larry, and just earlier today we were talking about the 30 under 30 at Forbes, how much money has been poured into some of them that have exploded or imploded. And the question is, are they lessons from scaled up models that imploded, and scaling where it scaled too quickly or without data? Because what I think we're seeing from the private sector that we can learn is the incentives are now misaligned, where people are coming up with numbers and data to get more funding to grow. And we're starting to see that in our context, even in the social enterprise landscape. So there's a place for integrity, transparency, and accountability with scale. So I think lessons from that. The second is, I mentioned earlier that a few of these social change initiatives, Ashoka Schwab, Echoing Green, Skoll, are coming together to say, what can we learn from each other that we can document, that can shape the ecosystem, so that, and Catalyst 2030, so that the ecosystem is more nimble, and that we don't have to wait for 30 years for the next SIWA, the next BRAC, and that the new entities that are emerging can leapfrog based on the learnings. And I would love to see how the Scaling Up Initiative enters and partners with some of these existing conversations that are ongoing.
Before I go to Mariah and Greg, let me just sandwich in an idea here, which is that we've been talking for a long time in the community of practice about type A and type B errors. The type A ones are the ones that we tend to talk most about, which are things that we wish would scale that don't. The type B are the ones where people have either scaled the wrong things or scaled prematurely on things. And a lot of the donor pressure these days, particularly the stuff on direct beneficiary, has yielded, in my opinion, a whole series of type B scaling errors. So I found myself more often than I imagined with the one with the foot on the brake rather than the foot on the accelerator on some of these things, to say this is just not ready yet. There's so much more to learn and do before we're ready to go there. Mariah?
Thanks, Larry. I agree with what Isabel and Didi have said. I think what works, but what doesn't, and what is sometimes frustrating to see is when some of the ideas are taken from civil society, from NGOs, by governments. They miss some of the pieces, first of all, which are very critical pieces. Let me explain, give you an example. Our insurance cooperative called Vimo Seva, the government heard about the microinsurance effort, and they came by and spent a couple of days with us, which was very thrilling for the women and for all of us to learn how to scale it up nationally for a national health insurance. And we stressed to them that one critical piece, it could not be a shortcut, we had to do this, is to take the time for education and awareness on insurance, which is quite an abstract concept for most of us. They missed that piece. And, we kept stressing that, don't miss it. Even after they rolled it out, we kept pushing them on that. But, it just didn't happen. And so the scaling up of the health insurance was really very limited. And then everybody said, oh, it failed. So that's one example I have. But also many times they seem to not, reinvent the wheel, do things that we know from civil society, from the learnings of BRAC, Pratham, others, have not worked. And yet, there's a tendency to invest in that for whatever reason, and there may be political reasons as well. But one of the things I think that we get asked a lot is the cost. What is the cost? So I think that also is a very important piece, particularly for government. And when I put my hand up earlier when Isabel was speaking, I just wanted to throw another thing out, and I'm curious what Greg has to say about this when scaling up with government. One thing we find is that somehow that spirit we seem to lose. The spirit that you see in self-help that comes from bottom up, that ownership, defending your enterprise at all costs. It just doesn't seem to be there when there's top-down scaling up, but maybe other people have other experiences.
Right.
Well, of course, that's the main fear, Mirai, and I'm confident. Unfortunately, there will be government programs that do lose the magic of some of the programming, but I don't think that should deter us from expecting that some will break through. And we have evidence, and I'm happy to say that it actually relates to NRLM and part of Isabel's book, that the government in Bihar in India has the largest high fidelity graduation program in the world, one that greatly pleases us at BRAC. And so I'm just reminded that you can, that's absolutely the great fear, Mirai. And of course, it's happened in other environments. How do we learn from that? I think one of the pieces of this that I've come to realize is that we're going to have those failures in government. How do we create an environment where there's that iteration, right? Where I'll take what I've done so far and I'll fix it in the next round. This idea that, as you said earlier, that we try once and it fails, and the RCT generates poor results in the first cohort, just feels like we're shooting ourselves in the foot and not allowing that kind of adaptation to happen. Because as we know, even in our private endeavors, BRAC often got it wrong early, right? But the point was, we scaled learning by doing. That's the point. It was perfect, and then we scaled. We actually were learning by doing. And I think getting into that mindset, and frankly, sensitizing the donor and funder communities to some of that, is really an important part of the scaling piece.
I'll share two lessons, if I could, out of the community of practice that I think might be relevant here. One is that it's been our experience that governments think about costs quite differently than donors do. When donors think about cost, they think about return on investment. When governments think about cost, they tend to think about opportunity cost. Basically, what would I have to not do, or what would I have to do differently? And increasingly in this particular environment right now, where many of them are debt burdened, taking on incremental costs, even if the return is high, is very difficult for them. It's politically very difficult because it has to be at the expense of something. So simply proving that there's a high return on investment doesn't do it unless you can complete the conversation about where would those resources actually come from on a sustainable basis, and how can you justify that change. A second thing that's really struck me recently, more than I think it did before, is the fact that governments, it used to be the case that people outside government had not really found their voice in talking to governments. And a lot of the preaching we did as a community of practice was how to engage government. Now I'm hearing from friends and colleagues who are ministers of government that they don't know what to do with the array of interventions that are trying to influence government. So the predicament, in a sense, is inverted. It's a better problem than the old problem, but it's a problem nevertheless. So it seems to me it's going to behoove us as well as them to try to find ways that the dialogue between the innovations on the one hand and the large systems on the other improves from where it is right now. So it's not just random who happens to break through with an idea because they know a person, but rather somehow derivative of the things that are really working on the ground or have the potential to have the support they need. Let me use that as a bit of a launch. Was that your hand going up, Greg?
Sure, I was just going to answer something.
Yeah, let me go back to you,
question,
and then I'll go to
but go back.
Either one.
Just quickly on the cost question, which is that governments are already investing a huge amount in liberty. And so sometimes it's not even a question of the incremental cost. It's really more about how you use your existing investments much more productively. So anyway, just to quickly comment on that, sometimes it's not about adding.
Fair enough.
Even the Mexico example in the book was about substituting one kind of subsidy for another one and making it more productive.
Right. But that's exactly what I mean. In that case, in the final analysis, but it required a decision or willingness to move away from subsidy form number one to go to number two on this. And there were losers in that system as well as winners. Mariah, you want to go next? You can pick any piece of this that interests you. You're still on mute.
Sorry about that. No, I didn't. I didn't have my hand up, so I'm happy to listen and take other questions.
Yeah, can I take Leonard's question? I think he had a. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So in the chat, Leonard had two questions. One about technical optimism, which is the type B mistake, and the other one was about the mindset biases on letting go. And so on the technical optimism, I think we see that a lot in the private sector. If you remember WeWork and how these big bets and people want to put more money, otherwise it's not worth it. That comes from that funding world. But in the development world, we love magic bullets. And guess what? There are no magic bullets. Development is so much more complex. And so I think falling in love with the solution is a real issue that we need to move away from. Falling in love with the problem is actually what we need in any adaptation that we're going to do. The Ultra Poor program, for example, even though it's a solution that has been really tested in 6 different countries, there's a lot of adaptation that goes into each country that you go. And then on the mindset biases, the most important one we have found, and actually I suffer from it myself, is the founder syndrome. When you have a founder who have a huge vision and can inspire people, but then what you really need is operationalizing. You need a COO. You need somebody who is interested in making things work rather than having many new ideas. And we see that a lot throughout the world. So I think that's how I would answer Leonard's question. And then Abe had a question on NGO size versus scale of impact. And I think we have addressed it somewhat in this conversation about the importance that size doesn't really mean impact. I think Mirai mentioned it. This idea of being lean but with high impact is one that I hope the book makes the case for. So those are the two questions that I saw on the chat that I wanted to answer.
A couple of other things. Let me see what you think about. Oh, go ahead, Mariah.
Oh, sorry. I just, Isabel just triggered a thought, which is also, we tend to, when we're scaling up, create all sorts of federations, cluster level federations, this, that. I mean, we should be clear also what is their role, how are they going to be sustainable. We invest a lot in them, and I'm thinking of our own government programs. But then what? I mean, we've been talking to some of the federations that have been promoted by government, and they're quite at sea, I must say. They're saying, what should we do now? Give us some ideas. We have the money, but we don't know really where to go from here. So I think also the forms of organization we choose, when we choose to build them, those kinds of questions. And then, of course, cost considerations are there as well. How is all of this going to be sustainable? If there's a constant oxygen via government investments, that's a different issue. But, for those of us who are in the not-for-profit or social enterprise, collective enterprise sector, that's not an option.
Every one of those hierarchical elements or every one of those intermediating elements needs its own business model, because each and every piece of that needs to be sustained in order for the enterprise to be sustained. Didi?
Yeah, so addressing Femi's question in the chat and tying it to Isabel's, I've been someone who's gradually successfully walked away from ventures that have scaled. And the truth is, it takes humility to know when to step away as the founder. It also takes strong values that are embedded within the organization, a strong board that renews itself, systems and structures that are non-negotiable, and clear and open communications with both the stakeholders and the funders around the role of the founder. And I can just tell you, I've been having conversations. You know, Larry mentioned I have a new role. I've been having conversations like I'm leaving Nigeria. That doesn't mean my organizations are going to die. And because I've gradually demonstrated that I'm stepping away, the funders still have confidence in the teams. And that's really important. And so I say that with all humility. It's not easy, but it's possible to do. But we have to do it in our lifetime. We can't wait till we don't have that luxury to do it and to guide that process. Thank you.
Thanks. Greg, what does that look like when BRAC is working in a country other than Bangladesh?
Larry, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I am. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No?
Yes.
Yes.
We can.
Okay. Greg, I was asking you, how does this differ when BRAC is working in a country that's not Bangladesh?
You know, in our view, it really shouldn't. And, you know, some of the fundamental principles should remain. So first is that BRAC was founded on ideas that were invited in from outside Bangladesh. So we were willing to take any of the best ideas from around the world, but actually make them work in our reality in Bangladesh. So that was the scaling question. It didn't have to be invented in Bangladesh. So that's the first thing. The second is that some of what we believe is universal, which is you start with people. Women are the catalysts of change. Those are fundamental for us universal principles that we don't think are isolated to Bangladesh, but rather have, you know, power around the world. Then the question becomes execution at scale. That's really where maybe our most fundamental challenges are outside Bangladesh, but it's not as if we've not gotten anywhere. We've got some sizable microfinance. We're starting into some social enterprises outside of Bangladesh. We've got, you know, sort of other fairly large scale programs. So all this to say, yes, of course, there are some advantages we have in Bangladesh as the sort of country where it started. We believe some of that is universal and transferable, but it's certainly not cut and paste. Certainly, the last thing I'd say is just on our talent pool, it is much more international every year across BRAC, and so a couple. But yeah, it's not easy.
I'd mention one other thing that I think we've learned over the last decade or so in the community of practice, and that is a point that several of you have made in terms of the time it takes to do this and the number of diversions along the path that occur. The fact that I haven't seen yet one straight line to scale, not one. And two things change. The scaling strategy changes, but the intervention itself changes. And somehow the adaptation is taking place in both those domains under what I don't have a good empirical justification for this, but in my experience, in what usually ends up being about a 15-year period. So for the ones that do succeed in scaling, it ends up being about that long, and with a number of twists and turns in the road. So if you're going from project to project and the principal funding is external, it's very difficult to get past the political economy of challenge that creates. And so where you've got the kind of driving force internally, and you can actually somehow manage to garner support in behalf of that, it's at least a somewhat easier pathway. Ndidi? Is your hand up? No. Okay. Isabel, I want to go back, if I could, to you on this issue of where the change originates. I think it's a little hard to be entirely cut and dried about this, but it just feels to me, as somebody who's been in the development and climate change space for a long time, that a lot of it is an idea that's being brought in, tested, and then hopefully scaled. And the examples we're showcasing today are all not that. Do you think that's an inevitable piece of what it really takes for something to create sustainability at scale? Or do you think things really can be brought in and then just kind of find their footing internally?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question. It depends. I think it depends. We saw with the oportunidades how it scaled throughout the world, but we see that there are other cases where really you have to have a community-based solution to the problem. So I think it's a difficult. I'm not sure I have an answer. And Johannes had a really interesting question here that resonated with others. If I can answer that. In terms of if it's so difficult to scale, how do you communicate it in a way that doesn't put people off? And I think there I take my psychoanalyst examples. How do you tell people that a psychoanalysis will take 3 or 4 years, 3 times a week? And I think it's the pain. It's the pain of a patient that comes saying, I need to change my life. This is no longer working, and that gives you the sort of the bonding and the trust, and you build the trust to be able to do that work together. The same is true with scaling. I think you will get organizations who are in pain. When you're growing very quickly, for example, and you're not scaling well, it's very painful. And the same is true when you have for years a solution that can really fill a huge gap, but you're not scaling. That pain also brings you into the task. So I think an explanation of how this is happening, and it's not the organization's problem, but it's because scaling is difficult. That is the task at hand. That's one. And second, somebody mentioned it in the chat as well, building early wins so that you're building the trust that this can actually take you out of that trap that you felt that you could not scale, and you build together that vision of where you want to go, and then show in the early stages that you're already having a shift. So I think that would be my answer to Johanna's very good question.
Let me go with one final question for each of you, which is, again, looking to the future on this. If you put on your most optimistic hat, but optimistic with a pragmatic edge on it, where would you have us as a collective community focus ourselves going forward to try and really move this enterprise to the future? Didi, I'll start with you.
I would say two areas of interest and focus. One is what needs to change in terms of our own capacity to leverage innovation, technology, AI to scale. I think many of us, especially the older generation, have not caught up with some of the promises of technology to enable us to scale in new ways, measure our impacts, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a new area for me that I would love to see work done. And then the second, I think I've alluded to it repeatedly, which is, I think, honestly, we continue to work in silos and to have the same conversations, and we need to be having more holistic conversations with funders and with government about what needs to change, about how they engage with social innovators in this landscape, and what needs to change from our end and their ends to ensure that we address the wicked problems, because the problems are not getting fewer. They're actually getting deeper and more intractable. And as someone who's worked in this space for 25 years, I'm more worried about the future than when I started. And I think we really need to come together and solve the problems holistically. Thank you.
I wish I didn't agree with you. Greg.
Yeah, our founder was on Hard Talk once, and he said, how can you be in this business and not be an optimist? You've got to believe. That's part of why we're here. I would say the focus, I think, is, one of the focuses, Larry, might be on the funding world. And I think a lot of the funding is actually counter to scale. It wants immediate results. It doesn't want deviations from plan. It starts with some idea somewhere very far away from the problem and says, try that and test that there. I think, to me, some of a large part of what gives me hope is the idea that we can actually work directly with the people who we're trying to solve for. And by starting there, I think we've got the potential to really scale large-scale problems.
Thank you. All right.
So first of all, I agree with what other panelists have said. And just to add, one of the things we found that is very important and helpful to scale are enterprise support systems, what we call at SEVA women's enterprise support systems, which is basically offering a whole lot of support, different support, not just a package that's dumped on, but as and when it's needed to help the social enterprises to scale. And we have to be patient, as we've been hearing, and it's a long haul, but it's very important to have these kind of enterprise support systems. The model in the outside world seems to be for accelerators, and then once the job is done, well, it doesn't. The job is never done, actually. So the enterprise support system, and I think use of digital tools for scaling. I agree with Ndidi. And I think another thing is a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas, what works, what doesn't. There is some of that going on in civil society, like a team from SEVA regularly goes to BRAC, for example. But I think there has to be much more of that, because we can learn from each other's successes and failures, what works and what doesn't, even though context is important.
Thank you. Isabel.
So I agree with tech funders' patience. I also think that we really need to think about scale with a framework from the South. I think there's so much richness and innovation happening there, and scale. I can think of, Bangladesh, India, Nigeria. I mean, the scale is just, massive. But I love what Greg has put on the chat, the counter scale of the development world. So that makes me think, understanding what in this system, in this development system, is producing this counter scale reality. I think that understanding of where is the system is designed to produce exactly what it's producing. So understanding that and understanding what are the leverage points to get into breaking this counter scale of the development system.
Well, that provides me exactly the link I wanted to make. Thank you so much. Which is to say that the work the community of practice is doing on the role of funders is not because we think funders are the most important agent in this, quite the contrary, but because we think a lot of the incentives and systems coming out of there are inadvertently working against scaling. And it's a place we think we have a chance of penetrating the system. So we've now done 12 case studies of what individual funders are doing or aspire to do or haven't yet done. We're hoping to do another 10 this year, 2024. But one of the things we want to make sure is really fully integrated this year is what it looks like from the other end of the funding spectrum, not from the funder side, but from the people who are either dependent upon or supported by that funding. That means all of you on this particular call. So I would like to extend a reach in your direction to please involve yourself in that particular piece of work, as well as in the more general work of the community of practice. And I'll do that by simply telling you that the next 9 sessions are either sectoral or thematic. You can find out what they are by looking at the website. The final session on the 26th is going to be looking particularly to the future of scaling and the future of the community of practice. And if you can possibly join us, then please do, because we really are trying hard to get as much input into this as we can, because this organization is only as good and as strong as its members. That now means you. So if you would please join us, please help us, and please join me in giving a big round of applause to our book writers and our panelists today. It was a wonderful session. Thank you so much.